Chapter 7. That night there was a bad storm. It hadn't let up when dawn struggled to cross the world's palm with silver, and it continued on through the day's march. It is a very demoralizing thing to tramp along and be rained on, a cold rain at that. How I've always hated the mud, through which it seems I've spent centuries marching. We sought after a shadow, a way that was free of rain, but nothing we did seemed to matter. We could march to amber, but we would do it with our clothing sticking to us, to the drumbeat of the thunder, with the flashing of the lightning at our backs. The next night the temperature plummeted, and in the morning I stared past the stiff flags and regarded a world gone white beneath a gray sky, filled with flurries. My breath went back in plumes behind me. The troops were ill-equipped for this, save for the hairy ones, and we got them all moving quickly to prevent frostbite. The big red guys suffered. Theirs had been a very warm world. We were attacked by tiger, polar bear, and wolf that day. The tiger Blaze killed measured over 14 feet from tail tip to nose. We marched on well into the night, and the thaw began. Blaze pushed the troops to get them out of the cold shadows. The trump of amber indicated that a warm, dry autumn prevailed there, and we were nearing the real earth. By midnight on that second night, we'd marched through slush and sleet, cold rains, warm rains, and on into a dry world. The orders were given to make camp then, with triple security cordons. Considering the tired condition of the men, we were ripe for an attack. But the troops were staggering and couldn't be pushed much further. The attack came several hours later, and Julian led it. I learned later from the description given by the survivors. He headed commando raids against our most vulnerable campsites on the periphery of the main body. Had I known it to be Julian, I would have used his trump to try to hold him, but I only knew it after the fact. We'd lost perhaps 2,000 men in the abrupt winter, and I didn't yet know how many Julian had accounted for. It seemed the troops were beginning to get demoralized, but they followed when we ordered them ahead. The next day was one continuous ambush. A body of men the size of ours could not be allowed to deviate sufficiently to try to deal with the harassing raids Julian led against our flanks. We got some of his men, but not enough. 1 for every 10 of ours, perhaps. By high noon we were crossing the valley that paralleled the seacoast. The forest of Arden was to the north and our left. Amber lay directly ahead. The breezes were cool and filled with the odors of earth and its sweet growing things. A few leaves fell. Amber lay 80 miles distant and was but a shimmer above the horizon. That afternoon, with a gathering of clouds and but the lightest of rains, the bolts began to fall from the heavens. Then the storm ceased, and the sun came forth to dry things off. After a time we smelled the smoke. After another time we saw it, flapping skyward all about us. Then the sheets of flame began to rise and fall. They moved towards us, with their crunching, constant footsteps, and as they came nearer, we began to feel the heat, and somewhere, way back along the lines, a panic arose. There were cries, and the columns swelled and welled forward. We began to run. Flakes of ash were falling about us now, and the smoke grew thicker. We sprinted ahead, and the flames rushed even closer. The sheets of light and heat flapped a steady, welling thunder as we ran, and the waves of warmth beat upon us, washed over us. Soon they were right there alongside us, and the trees blackened and the leaves flaked down, and some of the smaller trees began to sway. For as far ahead as we could see, our way was an alley of fires. We ran faster, for soon things would be worse, and we were not mistaken. Big trees began to topple across our path. We leaped over them, we circled around them. At least we were on a trail. The heat became stifling, and the breath became heavy in our lungs. Deer and wolves and foxes and rabbits darted past us, fleeing with us, ignoring our presence and that of their natural enemies. The air above the smoke seemed filled with crying birds. Their droppings fell among us, went unnoticed. To burn this ancient wood, as venerable as the forest of Arden, seemed almost an act of sacrilege to me. But Eric was prince in Amber, and soon to be king. I suppose I might have too. My eyebrows and hair were singed. My throat felt like a chimney. How many would this assault cost us, I wondered. 70 miles of wooded valley lay between us and Amber, and over 30 behind us, going back to the forest's end. Blaze, I gasped. 2 or 3 miles ahead of us, the trail forks. The right branch comes more quickly to the river Oisen, which goes down to the sea. I think it's our one chance. The whole valley of Garneth is going to be burned. Our only hope lies in reaching the water. He nodded. We raced on, but the fires outpaced us. We made it to the fork, though, beating out flames in our smoldering clothing, wiping ashes from our eyes, spitting such from our mouths, running hands through our hair when the flamelets nested there. Only about a quarter mile more, I said. I had been struck several times by falling boughs. All the exposed areas of my skin pulsed with a more than feverish pain, and many of the covered areas as well. We ran through burning grasses, heading down a long slope, and when we reached the bottom we saw the water, and our speed increased, though we didn't think it possible. We plunged in and let the cold wetness embrace us. Blaze and I contrived to float as near together as possible as the currents took us, and we were swept along the twisting course of the Oisen. The interlocked branches of the trees overhead had become as the beams in the cathedral of fire. As they broke apart and collapsed in places, we had to turn onto our bellies and swim or dive for the deepest places, depending on how near we were. The waters about us were filled with hissing and blackened debris, and at our backs, our surviving troops' heads in the river seemed as a strip of floating coconuts. The waters were dark and cold, and our wounds began to ache, and we shivered and our teeth chattered. It was several miles before we left the burning wood and reached the low, flat, treeless place that led on to the sea. It would be a perfect place for Julian to be waiting with archers, I decided. I mentioned this to Blaze, and he agreed, but he didn't reckon there was much we could do about it. I was forced to agree. The woods burned all around us, and we swam and we drifted. It seemed like hours, but must have been less, before my fears began to materialize and the first volley of our arrows descended. I dove and swam underwater for a long distance. Since I was going with the current, I made it quite a way along the river before I had to surface once more. As I did, more arrows fell about me. The gods knew how long this gauntlet of death might be drawn, but I didn't want to stick around and find out. I gulped air and dove once more. I touched bottom. I felt my way among rocks. I moved along for as far as I could, then headed toward the right bank, exhaling as I rose. I burst through the surface, gasped, took a deep breath, and went down again without sticking around to get the lay of the land. I swam on till my lungs were bursting, and surfaced then. This time I wasn't quite so lucky. I took an arrow through my biceps. I managed to dive and break off the shaft when I struck bottom. Then I pulled out the head and continued on by means of the frog kick and an underbody sculling with my right hand. The next time up I'd be a sitting duck, I knew. So I forced myself on until the red flashes crossed my eyeballs and the blackness crept into my head. I must have stayed down for 3 minutes. When I surfaced this time, though, nothing happened, and I trod water and gasped. I made my way to the left bank and grabbed hold of the trailing undergrowth. I looked all around me. We were running short on trees at this point, and the fires hadn't gotten this far. Both banks seemed empty, but so did the river. Could I have been the only survivor? It didn't seem possible. After all, there'd been so many of us when the last march began. Alright, sorry I had to take care of something. Let me see if I remember where I left off here. Both banks seemed empty, but so did the river. Could I have been the only survivor? It didn't seem possible. After all, there'd been so many of us when the last march began. I was half dead with fatigue, and my entire body was laced with aches and pains. Every inch of my skin seemed to have been burned, but the waters were so cold that I was shaking and probably blue. I'd have to leave the river soon if I wanted to live. I felt that I could manage a few more underwater expeditions, and I decided to chance them before departing for the sheltering depths. Or from the sheltering depths. Somehow I managed 4 more laps, and I felt then that I might not come up again if I tried a fifth. So I hung onto a rock and caught my breath, then crawled ashore. I rolled onto my back and looked all around. I didn't recognize the locale. The fires hadn't reached it yet, though. There was a thick clump of bushes off to my right, and I crawled towards it, crawled into it, fell flat on my face, and went to sleep. When I awoke, I wished I hadn't. Every inch of me ached, and I was sick. I lay there for hours, half delirious, and finally managed to stagger back to the river for a long drink of water. Then I headed back for the thicket, made it, and slept again. I was still sore when consciousness came once more, but a little bit stronger. I walked to the river then back, and by means of my icy trump found that Blaze was still alive. "Where are you?" he asked when I made the contact. "Damned if I know," I replied. "Lucky to be anywhere at all. Near the sea, though. I can hear the waves, and I know the smell." "You're near the river?" "Yes." "Which bank?" "Left, as you'd face the sea. North." "Then stay put," he told me, "and I'll send someone after you. I'm assembling our forces now. I've already got over 2,000 together, and Julian won't come near us. More keep straggling in every minute." "Okay," I said, and that was it. I stayed put. I slept as I did so. I heard them bashing about in the bushes and was alert. I pushed some fronds aside and peered forth. It was 3 of the big red guys, so I straightened my gear and brushed all my garments, ran a hand through my hair, stood erect and swayed, took several deep breaths, and stepped forth. "I'm here," I announced. 2 of them did double takes, blades in their hands as I said it. But they recovered, smiled, paid me deference, and conducted me back to the camp. It was perhaps 2 miles distant. I made it without leaning. Blaze appeared and said, "We've got over 3,000 now." Then he called for a medical officer to take care of me again. We were undisturbed all through the night, and the rest of our troops straggled in that night and the following day. We had perhaps 5,000 by then. We could see amber in the distance. We slept another night, and on the following morning we set forth. By afternoon we made maybe 15 miles. We marched along the beach, and there was no sign of Julian anywhere. The feeling of pain from my burns began to subside. My thigh was healthy, but my shoulder and arm still hurt from here to hell and back again. We marched on, and soon we were within 40 miles of amber. The weather stayed clement, and all of the wood to our left was a desolate, blackened ruin. The fire had destroyed most of the timber in the valley, so for once there was a thing in our favor. Julian nor anybody else could ambush us. We'd see them coming a mile off. We made another 10 miles ere the sun failed, and we bivouacked on the beach. The next day I remembered that Eric's coronation was near at hand, and I reminded Blaze. We'd almost lost count of the days, but we realized we still had a few remaining. We led a speed march till noon, then rested. By then, we were 25 miles away from the foot of Colvere. By twilight, the distance was 10, and we kept on. We marched till midnight, and we bivouacked once again. By that time, I was beginning to feel fairly alive once more. I practiced a few cuts with my blade and could almost manage them. The next day, I felt even better. We marched until we came to the foot of Colvere, where we were met by all of Julian's forces, combined with many from Kane's fleet, who now stood as foot soldiers. Blaze stood there and called things, like Robert E. Lee at Chancellorsville, and we took them. We had maybe 3,000 men when we had finished off everything Julian had to throw against us. Julian, of course, escaped. But we had won. There was celebration that night. We had won. I was very afraid by then, and I made my fears known to Blaze. 3,000 men against Colvere. I'd lost the fleet, and Blaze had lost over 98% of his foot soldiers. I did not look upon these as rejoiceable items. I didn't like it. But the next day we began the ascent. There was a stairway, allowing for the men to go 2 abreast alongside it. This would narrow soon, however, forcing us to go single file. We made it 100 yards up Colvier, then 2, then 3. And then the storm blew in from the sea, and we held tight and were lashed by it. Afterward, a couple of 100 men were missing. We struggled on, and the rains came down. The way grew steeper, more slippery. A quarter of the way up Colvier, we met with a column of armed men descending. The first of these traded blows with the leaders of our vanguard, and 2 men fell. 2 steps were gained, and another man fell. This went on for over an hour, and by then we were about a third of the way up, and our line was wearing back toward Blaze and myself. Sorry, the enunciation sometimes gets weird. It was good that our big red warriors were stronger than Eric's troops. There would come a clash of arms, a cry, and a man would be brought by. Sometimes he would be red, occasionally furry, but more often he wore Eric's colors. We made it to the halfway point, fighting for every step. Once we reached the top, there would be the broad stair, of which the one to Rubma had been but an image. It would lead up to the Great Arch, which was the eastern entranceway to Amber. Perhaps 50 of our vanguard remained, then 40, 30, 20, a dozen. We were about 2/3 of the way up by then, and the stair zigged and zagged its way back and forth across the face of Colvier. The eastern stair is seldom used. It is almost a decoration. Our original plans had been cut through the now blackened valley and then circle, climbing to take the western way over the mountains and enter Amber from behind. The fire and Julian changed all of this. We'd never have made it up and around. It was now a frontal assault or nothing, and it wasn't going to be nothing. 3 more of Eric's warriors fell, and we gained 4 steps. Then our front man made the long descent, and we lost 1. The breeze was sharp and cool from off the sea, and birds were collecting at the foot of the mountain. The sun broke through the clouds, as Eric apparently put aside his weather-making now, and we were engaged with his force. We gained 6 steps and lost another man. It was strange and sad and wild. Blaze stood before me, and soon his turn would come, then mine should he perish. 6 of the vanguard remained, 10 steps, then 5 remained. We pushed on, slowly, and there was blood on every step for as far back as I could see. There's a moral there, somewhere. The 5th man slew 4 before he fell himself, so bringing us another zig, or zag as the case may be. Onward and upward, our third man fighting with a blade in either hand. It was good that he fought in a holy war, for there was a real zeal behind each blow. He took 3 before he died. The next wasn't as zealous, or as good with his blades. He fell immediately, and then there were 2. Blaze drew his long filigreed blade, and its edge sparkled in the sun. "Soon, brother," he said, "we will see what they can do against a prince." "Only one, I hope," I replied, and he chuckled. I'd say we were 3/4 of the way there when Blaze's turn finally came. He leaped forward, immediately dislodging the first man to face him. The point of his blade found the throat of the second, and the flat of it fell alongside the head of the third, dislodging him also. He dueled a moment with the 4th and dispatched him. My own blade was in my hand, ready, as I watched and advanced. He was good, even better than I remembered him to be. He advanced like a whirlwind, and his blade was alive with light. They fell before it. How they fell, my friend! Whatever else you might say of Blaze, on that day he acquitted himself as became his rank. I wondered how long he could keep going. He'd a dagger in his left hand, which he used with brutal efficiency whenever he could manage a core. He left it in the throat of his 11th victim. I could see no end to the column which opposed us. I decided that it must stretch all the way to the landing at the top. I hoped my turn wouldn't come. I almost believed it. 3 more men plummeted past me, and we came to a small landing and a turn. He cleared the landing and began the ascent. For half an hour I watched him, and they died. I could hear the murmurs of awe from the men behind me. I almost thought he could make it to the top. He used every trick available. He baffled blades and eyes with his cloak. He tripped the warriors. He seized wrists and twisted with his full strength. We made it to another landing. There was some blood on his sleeve by then, but he smiled constantly, and the warriors behind the warriors he killed were ashen. This helped him too. And perhaps the fact that I stood ready to fill the gap also contributed to their fears and so slowed them, worked on their nerves. They'd heard of the naval engagement, I later learned. Blaze worked his way to the next landing, cleared it, turned again, and began to ascend. I hadn't thought he could make it that far then. I didn't think I could make it as far as he had. It was the most phenomenal display of swordsmanship and endurance I'd seen since Benedict had held the pass above Arden against the Moonriders out of Ganesh. He was tiring, though. I could see that, too. If only there was some way for me to relieve him, to spell him for some time. But there wasn't, so I followed, fearing every stroke might be his last. I knew that he was weakening. We were within 100 feet of the top at that point. I suddenly felt for him. He was my brother, and he'd done well by me. I don't think he thought he'd make it by then, yet he was fighting on, in effect giving me my chance for the throne. He killed 3 more men, and his blade moved more slowly each time. He fought with the 4th for perhaps 5 minutes before he took him. I was certain the next would be his last. He wasn't, though. As he slew that man, I transferred my blade from my right hand to my left, drew my dagger with my right, and threw it. It went in up to the hilt in the throat of the next man. Blaze sprang over 2 steps and hamstrung the man before him, casting him downward. Then he cupped upward, ripping open the belly of the one behind that one. I rushed to fill the gap, to be right behind him and ready. He didn't need me yet, though. He took the next 2 with a new burst of energy. I called for another dagger, and one was passed to me from somewhere along the line. I kept it ready till he slowed once more, and I used it on the man he fought. The man was lunging as it spun in, so the hilt rather than the blade caught him. It struck against his head, though, and Blaze pushed against his shoulder and he fell. But the next man leaped forward, though he impaled himself, he struck Blaze upon the shoulder and they went over the edge together. By reflex, almost without knowing what I was doing, yet knowing fully in one of those microsecond decisions you justify after the fact, my left hand leaped to my belt, whipped out my pack of trumps, and cast them towards Blaze as he seemed to hang there for an instant, so rapidly do my muscles and perceptions respond, and I cried out, "Catch them, you fool!" And he did. I didn't have time to see what happened next, as I parried and thrust, then began the final lap of our journey up Colvere. Let's just say I made it, and was gasping as my troops came over the edge to support me there on the landing. We consolidated our forces and pressed again. It took us an hour to reach the great arch. We passed through. We entered Amber. Wherever Eric was, I'm sure he'd never have guessed we'd make it this far. And I wondered where Blaze was. Had he gotten a chance to grab a trump and use it before he reached the bottom? I guessed that I'd never know. We had underestimated all the way around. We were outnumbered now, and the only thing left to do was to fight on for as long as we could hold out. Why had I done such a foolish thing as throw Blaze my trumps? I knew he had none of his own, and that's what had dictated my response, conditioned perhaps by my years on the Shadow Earth. But I might have used them to escape if things went badly. And things went badly. We fought on till twilight, and by then there was only a small band of us remaining. We were surrounded at a point of 1,000 yards within Amber, and still far from the palace. We were fighting a defensive fight, and one by one we died. We were overwhelmed. Luella or Deirdre would have given me sanctuary. Why had I done it? I killed another man and put the question out of my mind. The sun went down and darkness filled the sky. We were down to a few hundred by then, and not much closer to the palace. Then I saw Eric, and I heard him shouting orders. If only I could reach him, but I couldn't. I'd probably have surrendered to save my remaining troops, who had served me far too well. But there was no one to surrender to, no one asking for surrender. Eric couldn't even hear me if I cried out. He was out of the way, directing. So we fought on, and I was down to 100 men. Let's be brief. They killed everyone but me. At me, they threw nets and unleashed blunted arrows. Finally, I fell and was clubbed and hog-tied, and then everything went away but a nightmare which attached itself and wouldn't let go, no matter what. We had lost. I awoke in a dungeon far below Amber. Sorry that I had made it that far. The fact that I still lived meant Eric had plans for me. I visualized racks and braces, flames and tongs. I foresaw my coming degradation as I lie there on the damp straw. How long had I been unconscious? I did not know. I searched my cell for a means of committing suicide. I found nothing that would serve this purpose. All my wounds blazed like suns, and I was so very tired. I lay down and slept once more. I awakened, and still no one came to me. There was none to buy, none to torture. Also, there was nothing for me to eat. I lay there, wrapping in my cloak, and I reviewed everything that had happened since I'd awakened in Greenwood and refused my hypo. Better, perhaps, if I hadn't. I knew despair. Soon Eric would be crowned king in Amber. This thing might already have occurred, but sleep was so lovely a thing, and I was so tired. It was the first real chance I'd had to rest and forget my wounds. The cell was so dark and smelly and damp. Let me just look ahead here. I'm considering reading another chapter since it's been so long. Let's see. 10 more pages? Sure, why not? Chapter 8. How many times I awakened and returned to sleep, I do not know. Twice I found bread and meat and water on a trap by the door. Both times I emptied the tray. My cell was almost pitch dark and very chilly. I waited there and I waited. Then they came for me. The door swung open and a feeble light entered. I blinked at it as I was called forth. The corridor without was filled to overflowing with armed men, so I wasn't about to try anything. I rubbed at the stubble on my chin and went to where they took me. Sorry. And I lost my spot. After a long walk, we came to the hall of the spiral stair and began to ascend. I asked no questions as we moved, and no one offered me any information. When we reached the top, I was conducted further into the palace proper. They took me to a warm, clean room and ordered me to strip, which I did. Then I entered a steaming tub of water, and a servant came forth and scrubbed me and shaved me and trimmed my hair. When I was dry again, I was given fresh garments, of black and of silver. I donned them, and a black cloak was hung about my shoulders, its clasp a silver rose. "You are ready," said the sergeant of the guard. "Come this way." I followed him, and the guard followed me. I was taken far to the back of the palace, where a smith placed manacles about my wrists, fetters on my ankles, with chains upon them too heavy for me to break. Had I resisted, I knew I would have been beaten unconscious, and the result would have been the same. I had no desire to be beaten unconscious again, so I complied. Then the chains were taken up by several of the guards, and I was led back toward the front of the palace. I had no eyes for the magnificence that lay all about me. I was a prisoner. I would probably soon be dead or on the rack. There was nothing I could do right now. A glance out of the window showed me that it was early evening, and there was no place for nostalgia as I passed through the rooms where we had played as children. I was led up a long corridor and into the great dining room. There were tables all over the place, and people seated all about them, many of whom I knew. All the fine gowns and suits of amber burned about me on the bodies of the nobles, and there was music beneath the torchlight and food already upon the tables, though no one was eating yet. I saw faces that I recognized, like Flora's, and some strange faces. There was the minstrel, Lord Rhine. Yes, he had been knighted, by me, whom I had not seen in centuries. He turned his eyes away when my gaze fell upon him. I was taken to the foot of the huge center table and seated there. The guards stayed and stood behind me. They fastened the ends of my chains to rings fresh set in the floor. The seat at the head of my table was as yet unoccupied. I did not recognize the woman to my right, but the man to my left was Julian. I ignored him and stared at the lady, a little wisp of a blonde. "Good evening," I said. "I don't believe we've been introduced. My name is Corwin." She looked at the man at her right for support, a heavy red-headed guy with lots of freckles. He looked away and suddenly became engaged in an animated conversation with the woman to his right. "It's all right to talk with me, honest," I said. "It's not contagious." She managed a weak smile and said, "I'm Carmel. How are you, Prince Corwin?" "That's a sweet name," I replied, "and I'm just fine. What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?" She took a quick drink of water. Sorry, this part always kills me. "Corwin," said Julian, louder than necessary, "I think the lady finds you offensive and obnoxious." "What's she said to you so far this evening?" And he didn't blush. He whitened. "That will be enough from you." I stretched then and rattled my chains on purpose. Outside of the effect it produced, it also showed me how much slack I had. Not enough, of course. Eric had been careful. "Come closer and whisper me your objections, brother," I said, but he didn't. I had been the last to be seated, so I knew the time was near at hand, and it was. There came 5 trumpet notes from 6 trumpets, and Eric entered the hall. Everybody stood, except for me. The guards had to drag me to my feet by means of the chains and hold me there. Eric smiled and descended to the stair to my right. I could barely see his own colors beneath the ermine robe that he wore. He moved to the head of the table and stood before his chair. A servant came and stood behind him, and the wine stewards made their rounds, pouring. When all the glasses were filled, he raised his. "May you dwell forever in amber," he said, "which endureth forever." And everyone raised his glass, except for me. "Pick it up," said Julian. "Shove it up," said I. He didn't, only glared. But I leaned forward quickly then and raised my glass. There were a couple hundred people between us, but my voice carried, and Eric's eyes were upon me all the while as I said, "To Eric, who sits at the foot of the table." No one moved to touch me as Julian emptied his glass upon the floor. All the others did the same, but I managed to quaff most of mine before it was struck from my hand. Eric seated himself then, and the nobles followed suit, and I was released to fall back into my chair. The serving began, and since I was hungry, I ate as well as the rest of them, and better than most. There was constant music, and the meal lasted for over 2 hours. No one said a word to me during the whole time, and I said nothing more myself. But my presence was felt, and our table was quieter than the others. Cain sat further up along the table, at Eric's right hand. I gathered that Julian was out of favor. Neither Random or Deirdre was present. There were many other nobles whom I recognized, some of whom I had once counted as friends, but none of these would return my glances. I gathered then that it only required a small formality for Eric to be king in Amber. And this followed shortly. After dinner, there were no speeches. Eric simply stood. There came another flash of trumpets and a raucous sound upon the air. Then there was a procession leading all the way to the throne room of Amber. I knew what was coming next. Eric stood before the throne and everybody bowed, except for me, that is, and I was forced to my knees anyway. Today was the day of his coronation. There was silence. Then Cain bore in the cushion which held the crown of Amber. He knelt and froze in that position, offering it. Then I was jerked to my feet and dragged forward. I knew what was about to happen.
It came upon me in a flash, and I fought, but I was beaten down and brought to my knees at the foot of the stair before the throne. The music rose up softly. It was Greensleeves, and somewhere at my back Julian said, "Behold the crowning of a new king in amber." Then to me in a whisper, "Take up the crown and hand it to Eric. He will crown himself." I stared at the crown of amber upon the crimson cushion Cain held. It was wrought of silver and had 7 high points, each topped by a gemstone. It was studded with emeralds, and there were 2 huge rubies at either temple. I didn't move, thinking of the times I had seen the face of our father beneath it. "No," I said simply, and I felt a blow upon my left cheek. "Take it and give it to Eric," he repeated. I tried to strike at him, but my chains were drawn tight. I was struck again. I stared at the high, sharp peaks. "Very well," I finally said, and reached for it. I held it in both hands for a moment, then quickly placed it on my own head and declared, "I crown me, Corwin, King of Amber." It was removed immediately and replaced upon the cushion. Several blows fell upon my back. There came a murmuring throughout the hall. "Now pick it up and try it again," said Julian. "Take it and hand it to Eric." Another blow fell. "Okay," I told him, feeling my shirt grow wet. This time I hurled it, hoping to put out one of Eric's eyes. He caught it in his right hand and smiled down at me as I was beaten. "Thank you," he said. "Now hear me, all you present, and those of you who listen in shadow. I assume the crown and throne this day. I take into my hand the scepter of the kingdom of Amber. I have won the throne fairly, and I take it and hold it by the right of my blood." "Liar!" I cried, and a hand was clapped over my mouth. "I crown myself Eric the First, King of Amber." "Long live the king!" cried the nobles 3 times. Then he leaned forward and whispered to me, "Your eyes have looked upon the fairest sight they will ever behold. Guards, take Corwin away to the stithy, and let his eyes be burnt from his head. Let him remember the sights of this day as the last he might ever see. Then cast him into the darkness of the deepest dungeon beneath amber, and let his name be forgotten." I spat and was beaten. I fought every step of the way, but was taken forth from the hall. No one would look upon me as I went, and the last thing I remember was the sight of Eric seated upon his throne, pronouncing his blessing upon the nobles of Amber, and smiling. That which he said was done to me, and mercifully I fainted before it was finished. I have no idea how much later it was that I awakened with an absolute blackness and felt the terrible pains within my head. Perhaps it was then that I pronounced the curse, or perhaps it had been at the time that the white-hot irons had descended. I don't remember. But I knew that Eric would never rest easy upon the throne, for the curse of a prince of amber pronounced in a fullness of fury is always potent. I clawed at the straw in the absolute blackness of my cell, and no tears came. That was the horror of it. After a time, only you and I, gods know how long, sleep came again. Oh, only you and I, gods, know how long sleep came again. That makes more sense. When I awakened, there was still the pain. I rose to my feet. I measured off the dimensions of my cell, 4 paces in width, 5 in length. There was a lavatory hole in the floor and a straw tick mattress in a corner. The door contained a small slot at the bottom. Behind it was a tray which held a stale piece of bread and a bottle of water. I ate and I drank, but I was not refreshed. My head ached so, and there was nothing of peace within me. I slept as much as I could, and no one came to see me. I awakened and crossed my cell and felt for food and ate it when I found it. I slept as much as I could. After 7 sleeps, the pain was gone from my eye sockets. I hated my brother who was king in amber. Better he had killed me. I wondered at the popular reaction, but could not guess. When the darkness reached as far as amber, however, I knew that Eric would have his regrets. This much I knew, and this comforted me. Thus began my days of darkness, and I had no way of measuring their passage. Even if I had had eyes, I could not have distinguished day from night in that place. Time went on its way, ignoring me. There were occasions when I broke into a sweat over this and shivered. Had I been there months, only hours, or weeks, or had it been years? I forgot all about time. I slept, I paced. I knew exactly where to place my feet and when to turn. I reflected upon things I had done and hadn't done. Sometimes I would sit cross-legged and breathe slowly and deeply, and empty my mind and keep it that way for as long as I could. This helped, thinking of nothing. Eric had been clever. Although the power lived within me, now it was useless. A blind man cannot walk among shadows. My beard had grown down to my chest and my hair was long. I was always hungry at first, but after a time my appetite waned. Sometimes I grew dizzy when I stood up too rapidly. I could still see in my nightmares, but this hurt me even more when I awakened. Later, though, I felt somewhat distant from the events which had led up to this. I felt as though they had happened to a different person. And this, too, was true. I had lost a lot of weight. I could visualize myself, pallid and thin. I couldn't even cry, though I felt like it a couple of times. There was something wrong with my tear ducts. It was a dreadful thing that any man should be brought to this. Then one day, there came a light scratching upon the door. I ignored it. It came again, and still I did not respond. Then I heard my name whispered in the interrogative. I crossed the cell. "Yes?" I replied. "It's me, Rhine," he said. "How are you?" I laughed at that. "Fine, oh, just fine," I said. "Steak and champagne every night, and dancing girls. God, you should make the scene sometime." "I'm sorry," he said, "that there's nothing I can do for you," and I could feel the pain in his voice. "I know," I said. "I would if I could," he told me. "I know that too. I brought you something. Here." The little gate at the bottom of the cell door creaked slightly as it swung inward several times. "What is it?" I asked. "Some clean clothes," he said, "and 3 loaves of fresh bread, a head of cheese, some beef, 2 bottles of wine, a carton of cigarettes, and a lot of matches." My voice caught in my throat. "Thanks, Rhine. You're all right. How did you arrange this?" "I know the guard who's standing duty with his shift. He won't talk. He owes me too much." "He might try to cancel his debts by squealing," I said, "so don't do it again, much as I appreciate it. Needless to say, I'll dispose of the evidence." "I wish it had turned out different, Corwin. You and me both. Thanks for thinking of me when you were ordered not to." "That part was easy," he said. "How long have I been in this place?" 4 months and 10 days, he said. "So what's new in Amber?" "Eric reigns, that's all." "Where's Julian?" "Back in the Forest of Arden with his guard." "Why?" "Some strange things made it through Shadow recently." "I see. How about Kane?" "He's still in Amber, enjoying himself. Wenching and drinking, mostly." "And Gerard?" "He's admiral of the entire fleet." I sighed with a bit of relief. I was afraid his withdrawal during the naval engagement might have cost him something with Eric. "And what of Random?" "Oh, he's up the Holloways." "What? He was taken?" "Yes, he walked the pattern in Rebma and showed up here with a crossbow. He wounded Eric before he was taken." "Really? Why wasn't he slain?" "Well, rumor has it he's married a noblewoman of Rebma. Eric didn't want to court an incident with Rebma at this point. Moira has quite a kingdom, and there is talk that Eric is even considering asking her to be his queen. All gossip, of course, but interesting." "Yes," I said. "She liked you, didn't she?" "Somewhat. What did you hear?" "Or how did you hear?" "I was present when Random was sentenced. I got to speak with him for a moment. The Lady Vial, who claims to be his wife, has asked to join him in prison. Eric is not yet certain how to reply." I thought upon the blind girl, who I had never met, and I wondered at this. How long ago did this all happen? 34 days, he replied. That was when Random showed up. A week later, Vial made her request. She must be a strange woman if she really loves Random. Those were my sentiments, he replied. I can't think of a more unusual combination. If you should get to see him again, give him my regards and my regrets. Yes. How fare my sisters? Deirdre and Luella remain in Rebma. The Lady Florimel has been enjoying Eric's favors and stands high in the present court. I do not know where Fiona is presently. Has anything more been heard of Blaze? I'm sure that he died. He must have died, said Ryan. His body was never recovered, though. What of Benedict? As absent as ever. How about Brand? No word. And I guess that covers the whole family tree as it stands at present. Have you written any new ballads? No, he said. I'm still working on the Siege of Amber, but it will be an underground hit, if at all. I reached my hand out through the tiny gate at the bottom of the door. I would clasp hands with thee, I said, and I felt his hand touch mine. It was good of thee to do this thing for me. Don't do it again, though. It would be foolish to risk Eric's wrath. He squeezed my hand, muttered something, and was gone. I found his care package and stuffed myself with the meat, which was the most perishable item. I ate a lot of the bread to accompany it, and I realized I'd almost forgotten how good food can taste. Then I grew drowsy and slept. I don't think I slept very long, and when I awoke, I opened one of the bottles of wine. It didn't take as much as usual in my weakened condition to get me kinda high. I had a cigarette, sat down on my mattress, leaned back against the wall, and mused. I remembered Ryan as a child. I was already full grown by then, and he was a candidate for court jester. A thin, wise kid. People had kidded him too much. Me included. But I wrote music, composed ballads, and he'd picked up a lute somewhere and taught himself how to use it. Soon we were singing with voices together raised and all like that. Before long, I took a liking to him and we worked together, practicing the martial arts. He was lousy at them, but I felt kind of sorry for the way I'd treated him earlier, what with the way he had dug my stuff. So I forced the fake graces upon him and also made him a passable saber man. I'd never regretted it, and I guess he didn't either. Before long, he became minstrel to the court of Amber. I had called him my page all that while, and when the wars beckoned against the dark things out of shadow called the Wiremonken, I made him my squire, and we had ridden off to the wars together. I knighted him upon the battlefield at Jones Falls, and he had deserved it. After that, he had gone on to become my better when it came to the ways of words and music. His colors were crimson, and his words were golden. I loved him as one of my 2 or 3 friends in Amber. I didn't think he'd take the risk he'd had to bring me a decent meal, though. I didn't think anyone would. I had another drink and smoked another cigarette in his name to celebrate him. He was a good man. I wondered how long he would survive. I threw all the butts into the head and also, eventually, the empty bottle. I didn't want anything around to show I'd been enjoying myself, should a sudden inspection be held. I ate all the good food he had brought me, and I felt surfeited for the first time since I had been in durance. I saved the last bottle for one massive spell of drunkenness and forgetfulness. And after that time had passed, I returned to my cycle of recriminations. I hoped mainly that Eric had no measure of our complete powers. He was king in Amber, granted, but he didn't know everything. Not yet. Not the way Dad had known. There was 1,000,001 shot that might still work out in my favor. So much so, and so different, that at least it served to grant me my small purchase upon sanity there in the grip of despair. But maybe I did go mad for a time. I don't know. There are days that are great blanks to me now, as I stand here on the brink of chaos. God knows what they held, and I'll never see a shrink to find out. There are none of you, good doctors, could cope with my family anyway. I lay there and I paced there within the numbing darkness. I grew quite sensitive to sounds. I listened to the scurry of rats' feet through straw, the distant moaning of other prisoners, the echoes of a guard's footsteps as he approached with a tray of food. I began estimating distances and direction from things like this. I suppose I became more sensitive to odors also, but I tried not to think about them too much. Aside from the imaginable nauseating ones there was, for a long while, what I would swear to be the odor of decaying flesh. There was, for a long while, what I would swear to be the odor of decaying flesh. Sorry. I wondered, if I were to die, how long would it be before someone took notice? How many chunks of bread and bowls of slop would go uneaten before the guard thought to check within after my continued existence? The answer to that one could be very important. The death odor was around for a long while. Excuse me. I tried to think in terms of time again, and it seemed that it persisted for over a week. Though I rationed myself carefully, resisting the compulsion, the handy temptation, for as long as I could, I finally found myself down to my final pack of cigarettes. I tore it open and lit one. I had had a carton of Salem's and had smoked 11 packs. That was 220 cigarettes. I'd once timed myself with one, and it had taken me 7 minutes to smoke it. That made for a total of 1,540 minutes spent smoking, or 25 hours and 40 minutes. I was sure I had spent at least an hour between cigarettes. More like an hour and a half. Say an hour and a half. Now, figure that I was sleeping 6 to 8 hours per day. That left 16 to 18 waking hours. I guessed I was smoking 10 or 12 per day, so that meant maybe 3 weeks had passed since Ryan's visit. He had told me it was 4 months and 10 days since the coronation, which meant it was now around 5 months. I nursed my last pack, enjoying each one like a love affair. When they were all gone, I felt depressed. Then a lot more time must have passed. I got to wondering about Eric. How was he making out his liege? What problems was he encountering? What was he up to right now? Why hadn't he been around to torment me? Could I ever truly be forgotten in Amber, even by imperial decree? Never, I decided. And what of my brothers? Why had none of them contacted me? It would be so easy to draw forth my trump and break Eric's decree. No one did, though. I thought for a long while upon Moira, the last woman I had loved. What was she doing? Did she think of me ever? Probably not. Maybe she was Eric's mistress by now, or his queen. Did she ever speak to him of me? Again, probably not. And what of my sisters? Forget it. Bitches all, they. I'd been blinded once before by a cannon flashback in the 18th century on the Shadow Earth, but it only lasted for around a month and my sight had returned. Eric had had a permanent thing in mind, however, when he had given his order. I still perspired and shuddered, and sometimes woke up screaming whenever memory of the white-hot irons returned to me, hung there before my eyes. And then the contact. I moaned softly and continued to pace. There was absolutely nothing I could do. That was the most horrible part of the whole thing. I was as helpless as an embryo. To be born again into sight and fury was the thing for which I would give my soul, even for an hour with a blade in my hand to duel once again with my brother. I lay back in my mat and slept. When I awakened, there was food, and I ate once again and paced. My fingernails and my toenails had grown long. My beard was very long, and my hair fell across my eyes constantly. I felt filthy, and I itched all the time. I wondered whether I had fleas. That a Prince of Amber could be brought to this state drew a terrible emotion from the center of my being, wherever that may be. I'd been reared to think of us as invincible entities, clean and cool and diamond hard, like our pictures on the trumps. Obviously, we were not. At least we were enough like other men to have our resources. I played mental games. I told myself stories. I reviewed pleasant memories. There were many of these. I recalled the elements, wind, rain, snow, the summer's warmth, and the spring's cool breezes. I'd had a small airplane on the Shadow Earth, and when I flew it, I had enjoyed the sensation. I recalled the glistening panoramas of color and distance, the miniaturization of cities, The broad blue sweep of the sky, the herds of clouds. Where were they now? And the clean expanse of the ocean beneath my wings. I remembered women I had loved, parties, military engagements. When all that was done and I could help it no longer, I thought of Amber. One time when I did so, my tear glands began to function again. I wept. After an interminable amount of time, a time filled with blackness and many sleeps, I heard footsteps which paused before the door to my cell, and I heard the sound of a key within the lock. It was so long after Ryan's visit that I had forgotten the taste of the wine and the cigarettes. I could not really estimate its span, but it had been long. There were two men in the corridor, and I could tell this from their footsteps even before I heard the sounds of their voices. One of the voices I recognized. The door swung open and Julian said my name. I didn't answer right away, and he repeated it. "Corbin, come here." Since I didn't have much choice in the matter, I drew myself erect and advanced. I stopped when I knew I was near him. "What do you want?" I asked. "Come with me." And he took my arm. We walked along the corridor, and he said nothing, and I'd be damned if I'd ask him any questions. From the echoes, I could tell then that we had entered the big hall. Soon after, he guided me up the stair. Up and into the palace proper we went. I was taken to a room and seated in a chair. A barber set to work cutting my hair and my beard. I didn't recognize his voice when he asked me if I wanted the beard trimmed or removed. "Cut it off," I said, and a manicurist set to work on my nails, all 20 of them. Then I was bathed, and someone helped me to dress in clean garments. They hung loose on me. I was deloused also, but forget that. Then I was led into another black place filled with music and the odors of good food and the sounds of many voices and some laughter. I recognized it to be the dining room. The voices subsided a bit as Julian led me in and seated me. I sat there until the trumpet notes, to which I was forced to rise. I heard the toast called out. "To Eric the First, King of Amber. Long live the king." I didn't drink to that, but no one seemed to notice. It was Kane's voice that had called out the toast from far up along the table. I ate as much as I could, because it was the best meal I had been offered since the coronation. I gathered from conversation overheard that today was the anniversary of Eric's coronation, which meant I had spent an entire year in the dungeons. No one spoke to me, and I didn't make any overtures. I was present as a ghost only, to humiliate me and to serve as a reminder to my brothers, no doubt, as to the price of defying our liege, and everyone had been ordered to forget me. It went on well into the night. Someone kept me well provided with wine, which was something, and I sat there and listened to the music of all the dances. The tables had been removed by this time, and I was seated off somewhere in the corner. I got stinking drunk and was half dragged, half carried back to my cell in the morning, when the whole thing was over save for the cleaning up. My only regret was I hadn't gotten sick enough to dirty the floor or someone's pretty garments. Thus ended the first year of darkness. Woo! And we'll call it there because my voice is getting tired. Give you a good, close to an hour probably. Yeah, around an hour of content there. And we'll pick up next time on Chapter 9. I believe there's 10 chapters. There's only like 20 pages left. But my voice is tired, so it'll have to be a story for another day. It's starting to get to the point in the series where it picks up a lot, in my opinion. I think, honestly, the first book is definitely the weakest of the Amber Chronicles. It's still good, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely the weakest of the series. In my opinion, actually, I think they just get better as they go on. With the final book, Courts of Chaos, being probably my favorite in the Corwin cycle. I gotta say, I think the Merlin cycle as a whole is even better. I think the time between this series and the next, he becomes a much more experienced writer. Zelazny does, and I think that the Merlin cycle is much more interesting and feels like it aged a lot better to me. So, look forward to that. One day I'll get there. I think that I will record more frequently. Uh if not for having more or less free time, then for having more of an interest in the books as they go forward, because they get better from here on out. And so it's a lot easier to sit down and just like blitz through it. So I'll try to keep it regular. I know I say that like every time, but this is the first time where like I've read these so many times. I remember pretty much everything, but this was the first time we actually reached one of my favorite parts in the series, which was the fight up Colvir, and then the subsequent imprisonment of Corwin. Whenever I was a kid, I always thought that that was such a badass move to make the main character blind, like give him an actual serious wound, and then put him in a dungeon. Of course, since then, I mean, I've read many more books, but it still holds a special place in my heart, Um, still good book. We're almost done with the first book, and then we'll start Guns of Avalon, and Guns of Avalon is very good. Um, then I think it's Sign of the Unicorn after that. Hold on, let me check. Yeah, Sign of the Unicorn, and then Courts of Chaos. No, wait, no, I think there's one more after Sign of the Unicorn. Isn't there? Hold on, sorry. The Hand of Oberon, and then the Courts of Chaos. Yeah, because there's 5 in each. I think that as they go on, they get better for sure. But I definitely think that there's a huge jump in quality between the first and second book, because I think Guns of Avalon is like easily twice as good as Nine Princes in Amber. Although, I mean, it's really not that, it's not fair to say that, because, I mean, Nine Princes in Amber, Zelazny was still a fairly new author at this point. I mean, he'd written some of his classics already, like Lord of Light, I believe, already had been written at this point. And like a few of his other books, but it definitely is early in his career, like within the first few years of being a commercial writer. And it definitely just gets like better developed from here on out. Now you can't talk about Amber without talking about the there's some plot holes. I mean, man isn't the best author in the world when it comes to like considering every little aspect of things and like being super detail oriented. But he is great with like unique concepts and imagery, which I personally love. And I like his irreverent like tone and style. It's always a treat to read through. And it gets more pronounced as it goes along and like more refined. Um, it becomes less like a noir style and more like a Discworld sort of like mocking, sort of, not mocking, maybe more like a very like self-aware, like we're just gonna have a good time sort of thing. Less dramatic, but more fun. And I think that works better for him. Um, but yeah, there's definitely some plot holes with. You'll especially notice it. Well, I mean, we've already just encountered one during this chapter reading, where Corwin says he tossed his trumps to Eric because Eric, not Eric, to Blaze, because Blaze didn't have any of his own. But I'm pretty sure there was a place where he forgot that detail. Maybe he didn't, and maybe I'm misremembering, but I'm pretty sure there's a place where he forgot that detail and Blaze called him on the trump. And they had a chat. Of course, that does mean he could just only have a few trumps, but I mean, maybe a tiny plot hole there. But not a big deal. And of course, I could be totally misremembering that. Maybe it was Corwin contacting him each time. He also has some problems with, like, he doesn't stick to established spellings or canons for different places sometimes. Like the lighthouse of Cabra is called the lighthouse of Karba the first time, or the first couple of times, I think, that you see it spelled, and then it's called Cabra afterwards. And after that, it's consistent, but the first couple of times. And that also could just be the edition that I read, because it was very old, and it could have just been a typo. But, it's also, I mean, a made-up fantasy word, so it doesn't really matter if you change the spelling a little bit. And then he's also inconsistent with a couple of details with how time flows in different shadows, which is a concept that gets introduced later, possibly in the next book, but definitely, I believe, in Hand of Oberon, it plays like a major part. And then even more so in Merlin's cycle. So I guess look forward to that if you're into fun timeline stuff. Although it really isn't like a huge thing. It's more just like a take advantage of like timelines and different shadows so that you can have more time to plan stuff or heal from wounds, stuff like that. But he never quite keeps it consistent. But it's not a big deal. I mean, you know what he's talking about each time, so even if he doesn't like enunciate it the right way. But aside from that, like, the series is pretty good with the plot hole things. But it's just like you'll notice stuff like that after you read through it a couple of times, or maybe on your first read through. I'm not like a super astute reader. I only catch stuff on my, like, I start catching things on my second read through. Now, sometimes I'll catch stuff on my first read through. Like, I'm pretty good at like predicting where plot lines will go. But when it comes to like small details in the text, like say like in the Kingkiller Chronicles, all the little tiny details in that text that become relevant to like theorizing or towards future events, I did not start picking up on stuff like that until my second read through of the series. And each time I read a series, I kind of pick up on more each time, because my focus changes from being just solely on experiencing the book to like experiencing more of the world rather than just the characters. So, and there's like some stuff like that with Amber too. You can find some like different jokes and things. Like there's a book, I think in Hand of Oberon or Courts of Chaos, one of the two. There's a thing where Random says something about how silence beats a chamber pot in Amber. And Corwin says, "How's that?" And he says, "'Tis guilt, my lord, like a royal flush." And that's a joke that has some layers to it that I am still like not really 100% sure on. But obviously, guilt, GILT, is the spelling used in the joke. but it implies guilt like a royal flush, chamber pot, royal flush. And then you have guilt, could also be guilt. If someone is silent, that means they're guilty. Um, like a royal flush, guilt would imply that they're cheating at the game. Um, so there's like some interesting like bits of writing like that, but they just have like multiple implications. Um, when I was younger, I didn't really understand the joke at all, and so I thought that it meant like silence is golden because you just like guilt, like golden. Um, so I didn't really get it, and maybe that is like an intended implication, but I don't really think so because it doesn't really match in with the plot that was happening at the time. Although, you know, maybe so. I don't know. Anyhow, I've rambled enough. It was my usual like 10-minute ramble at the end of every one of these episodes. uh, that I always say I won't do, but then I do anyways. So I'll cut it off here, and I'll see you guys next time.